at MIT. He's also a co-founder of a nonprofit organization called LivableStreets, which does multimodal transportation advocacy in the Boston region. And he's going to talk today on street design outlaw. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess everyone's still getting settled. I want to thank everybody thank your seminar group for inviting me. This is an honor to come to Portland. Portland in a lot of ways was an inspiration for a lot of the work that I did in Boston, because 10 years ago when I founded LivableStreets, Portland was the place that was doing things, and so I'm really glad to be here. The idea of today's talk is to give you a sense of what happened behind the scenes with advocacy in Boston, and hopefully tell some stories and see what you guys think of what we were doing. So a little bit about me. I bike my kids to school. I guess in Portland that's nothing special. It actually is getting to be not that special in Boston anymore. When I first started biking her around in that green Ibert seat, I was like the only one in town. Now there's Ibert seats all over the place, and now no one even looks at me funny when I bike around with my kids. So Boston really has been changing over time. My background is engineering. I actually still use my HP 41 CX calculator to this day. And I also focused on policy for my undergraduate and graduate work. So I'm this weird hybrid between an advocate, someone who worked for government. After I founded LivableStreets 10 years ago, I started working for the city of Cambridge as a transportation planner for about 7 years. And now just left a year ago at MIT. So I have this weird not only multimodal, but multi-jurisdictional type of a thing. Coming to MIT has been a little bit of a challenge. I feel like trying to figure out how to be a researcher, but I'm really a practitioner at heart, has been a bit of a challenge. And so my work over the last year has been trying to figure out how to integrate the role of advocacy and practitioner work into what can academia help in solving some of those problems. So one of the first things that I struggled with is a lot of the work that I was doing is in this reflective practice, Donald Schoen kind of realm of how do you look back at the work that has been done to try to improve what was going on. And so I put that on the spectrum kind of as opposed to scientific approach, which is really that kind of like you don't really need to know much details about how everything works. You just want to study the numbers. And when you start getting toward reflective practice or participatory action research, I don't know how many of you are engaged in that sort of thing, but it starts to get the academic world uncomfortable. So that's what I'm hoping to work on through my work at MIT in the urban planning department. A couple things that I've been working on. We put together a Lego model in collaboration with the Media Lab that allows you to take some of these bus stations, move them around, and allows the public to engage in a dialogue about what would happen if you build bus rapid transit. And we have a display on the side that allows people to see, okay, well, how many more cars do you move? If you put this Lego piece in, it puts separated bike lanes on the side. What happens there? You take away parking. So trying to figure out how to engage the public in thinking about these in a different way than just the typical kind of presentation where government gives the speech and then people ask questions and then everyone goes home. A second tool that we've been working with on collaborative transit planning is this tool that allows you to focus on accessibility. So you can put in your address and you can say how long do you want your commute to be, and it'll tell you in real kind of like modeling terms how much accessibility do you have within that range. And then we programmed in some new transit routes, and we allow the public to say, okay, well, what if you put in a new transit line, a bus rapid transit line? What would that do? How would that affect your accessibility? So these are new tools that we've been testing to try to figure out how to engage the public in different ways than before. Over the summer with Peter Kuntz, through Northeastern, I teach a class with Peter Firth on transportation planning, and so that's sort of a highlight of my years doing that. For the city of Cambridge, I focused on street design projects. This is one example of a project that I had worked on. It's a one-way street with a bike lane that's even relatively new, and we ended up going through a process to rethink that whole project and ended up with a cycle track design, which is one of the first kind of real cycle track designs in the city, and that's the kind of work that I was doing working for the city. Another piece of these projects is always looking for roadway space that can be reclaimed. So I know I'm not supposed to use the pointer because then no one else can see it, but there's an island here and it's pretty small in terms of public space. There's a parking lane here that's unused, and there's 2 travel lanes here. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but the idea was, how could we expand that space and not have as much space used for cars? So this is the kind of area of how much expansion we got by removing some of those travel lanes. So always looking at it in terms of how much space is being used for cars and how much space is being used for other people. So if you're here, you probably know there's a problem. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but how do we end up with things where people are walking their dogs with their cars? We definitely have a problem with obesity that a lot of people are talking about as a health epidemic, and escalators to get to the fitness center that starts to get to be a bit much in terms of what's going on. So the sidewalk may end, but not for you guys. You guys are all going to be the ones going out there and trying to fix these problems. One of the biggest problems, and that we've been focusing on, is how far can children roam from their houses? And the answer is not very far, because traffic is unsafe in a lot of the neighborhoods. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how did we get to this point. It didn't just sort of happen. So I'm going to attempt to play part of this video. This is from a film called Contested Streets that was produced by Transportation Alternatives. This is just a snippet, but it's an hour-long production that's...
grandmas would lean out the window and watch the action. There was a lot of kind of informal surveillance going on. The streets were an extension, really, of private life.
I think we need to remember that the automobile was seen as the salvation of the city. That at the turn of the century, people saw the horse as the enemy, because the horse took up space. In other words, if you think of what a truck can carry, a horse and a wagon took up more space than that. And the horse usually dumped 10 pounds worth of manure on the streets every day per horse. Times 100,000 horses is a lot of
segment of the middle class begin to get automobiles. So there's a lot more of them on the street. But it's also that the city begins to orient itself around the automobile in a variety of ways. By the 1910s, certainly by the 1920s, out in Brooklyn or in stretches of the Bronx where the mass transit lines don't go, you're beginning to get little small houses now popping up with garages and with driveways. And so the very definition of living in residential neighborhoods is now being transformed to incorporate automobile use. And that struggle over whether or not, as the city expands farther and farther out from Manhattan, whether in fact it's going to be organized around mass transit or around the automobile is the great struggle now that takes place in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Essentially, the automobile wins.
To be fully dynamic, the American city must now accommodate the automobile. This is the vital factor of our new age. A forward-looking city is conscious of the automobile and automobile traffic as key factors. Often the substance of our urban structures is such as to resist the power of the demolition hammer. As a people, however, we are steadfast as we tackle problems, and our progress is certain to be steady as we clear away the structures that block progress.
All right, so there were obviously a lot of people who went to college and studied urban planning who then are leaders of this, who really thought that this was going to solve our problem. So I think kind of claiming that this was some evil plot to sort of populate us all with cars, I think is putting a bit much at the feet of these folks. But clearly it started to get out of control, and that's the part that we're trying to dig out of now. So, here we are today. Cars are getting bigger. Bikes are getting smaller. That's the story. So when did opposition start to happen? This started to happen in Europe. This started to happen in the U.S. And it started to happen because of safety issues, at least in New York.
But this is a city which is singularly ill-equipped, really. The roads, it's true, are kind of nice and flat, but on the other hand, they're also full of people. And so it's not surprising that what you get are a series of clashes over access to these streets. And people, in fact, are run down. As the Automobile Club, which was founded in 1899, is in the midst of this kind of battle over access to the streets. And it's just a year or so later that the first really nasty incident takes place when a Wall Street broker is being driven down to his work by his chauffeur, and they ran over little Louis Camille, a 2-year-old Italian lad, right in the middle of a densely populated Italian neighborhood. And people go wild, and they try to lynch this guy, his driver, and he's rescued. But it's the first, really, of many such encounters. Hundreds of children begin to be sort of knocked off.
And how many times have you thought?
So even early on in this process, people were recognizing that we were starting to go down a road that wasn't really working, but yet the engines were going too strong around oil and around the automobile industry. But you did have advocates, I assume everybody knows who this is, who were working to fight against this kind of mentality. And in some ways, we feel like we've come a long way, but oftentimes I'm finding we're having the same conversations today that they were having as advocates in the 60s. Donald Appleyard, who was a researcher in the 60s in San Francisco, did a pretty famous study where he said, well, what is the social impact of all this traffic? We were talking about the physical impacts and the safety impacts, but it turns out that if you have a lot of traffic on your street, you have fewer friends. So we can sort of intuitively that makes sense because, well, you don't spend as much time on the stoop because it's noisy, and when you're walking down the street, you're sort of rushing to get home. That kind of makes sense, but here's an academic who said, all right, I want to try to show the public that this phenomenon is actually happening, and came up with a study to do that. I'm going to talk a little bit about Cambridge, the Boston area, just to orient everybody. One of the problems with Boston is we've got all kinds of municipalities that are all abutting each other, each with its own administration and its own municipal government. Even Boston, the heart of Boston, is up north, and all of this is still considered the city of Boston, but some of it, when you start getting south, is pretty suburban, yet Cambridge and Somerville are pretty urban right near the core. So it makes it a real challenge as an advocate and as a city government employee to try to figure out how to get everyone talking to each other. Boston had its own history of anti-highway activism. A bunch of highways that were designed ended up being canceled in the early 1970s. That was a pretty big feat, and if we had not done that, Boston would be a completely different place. In fact, I probably wouldn't even be living there. One of the highways that was planned, so the typical city has these outer rings. This ring was pretty far out. That's Route 95. So they were planning on building this really tight inner ring right through the heart of the South End and Cambridge. This land was actually already cleared for the highway at the time that it was canceled. And this is the type of street that the highway would have run down. Turns out my daughter's school is right there. This is a rendering of what the highway would have been like. And, you know, sometimes the renderings don't look so bad, do they? I mean, it's nice and blue. It's a cool color. There's no traffic, so it looks really nice. But sort of, what do those things actually look like on the ground? They look pretty terrible. The Boston region is going through a period where a bunch of these highways that were all built around the same time are all crumbling, falling apart, and advocates through LivableStreets and others have been fighting to not replace them, actually rip them down and replace them with neighborhood boulevards, and that's been a huge part of the advocacy movement over the last couple of years. Government isn't necessarily opposed to it because that's a lot less money than rebuilding these elevated structures. So this is a sense of what Cambridge would look like, and this is where the highway would go through. This is the heart of Central Square, so it would have been a completely different place with that. Another thing that came out of that anti-highway movement was the addition of new transit. So because of various politics, and I'm sure you study this, a lot of this stuff happens because of politics. Tip O'Neill was in government through Massachusetts and was able to convert the highway money to transit money. It was the first time the federal government allowed that highway money to be converted to transit money, and allowed this transit line to be extended from Harvard up to Alewife through Davis Square. That was a really important extension. And also, this is the corridor that had been cleared for the highway, and instead of a highway going in, they put in a corridor for bikes and pedestrians, and they submerged the subway and rail line, so it's a really nice, seamless, kind of neighborhood-friendly transportation system. So we're starting to see things change in the Boston area. When I first founded LivableStreets 10 years ago, Boston had 0.3 of 1 mile of bike lanes. When you have to start talking about bike lane distances in small fractions, you know the city's in trouble. And this is 2005. This is not that long ago. Meanwhile, you guys were like, whoa, you had bike lanes all over the place. Things are beginning to change. This is a scene that 10 years ago I would have assumed was Portland, but this is a bridge going from Cambridge to Boston. And transit ridership is going up significantly, and that's also a phenomenon that's happening here. And Portland thought ahead in the 90s and came up with a good longer-range plan. It's now time for Portland to come up with the next set of long-range plan, but all this transit that you're starting to see is from people who were thinking back in the late 80s and 90s about Portland's future. So people want to live in the city. People want to get around on transit. How are we going to get people around on transit if our system is almost at capacity? So I managed to do that relatively quickly. I was worried I was going to go over time because I want to leave you guys time for conversation. So this gets to the heart of what I want to talk about. What is the role of advocates? One of the things about advocacy is that if you're a good advocate, you give all the credit to government, and then no one really knows that you did anything. It's this real challenge between being there behind the scenes, mobilizing members, but then how do you give the credit, and that's sort of the problem. So one of the things I'm going to tell you is some stories. Enough time has passed that it's okay for me to tell you some of these stories about how things actually happen. So I hope you enjoy that. So 10 years ago, I founded Livable Streets Alliance. There was already an advocacy group called Mass Bike. Unfortunately, they were opposed to facilities. They were a vehicular cyclist organization, so I couldn't work through them. We also had a pedestrian advocacy organization called Walk Boston, and we also had transit advocacy groups. So everyone was thinking, Jeff, you're crazy. Why are you starting a new group? And part of it was that no one was thinking about how to package all those things together in terms of livability. People didn't want to talk about bicycles. People didn't want to talk about walking. They wanted to talk about cities. They wanted to talk about quality of life and neighborhoods that people wanted to live in. So off I went, starting an organization, a very painful but rewarding exercise. The focus of what we got together to do was first inspire vision. One of the things that happened was one of our founding board members, Phil Goff, who's a old Portland advocate, came to Boston. I went for a bike ride with him along the Charles River, and he had his kid in the trailer and back. This is like 10 years ago. And he said, how come people aren't complaining up in arms about the horrible conditions of this path? And I thought, that's a really good question. I think people in the area just have become numb to the fact that this is just the way it's going to be and nothing's going to change. And so there was this kind of deadened effect of people in the Boston area that this stuff doesn't matter and there's nothing we can do about it. Well, part of what the goal of the organization was to say, we have a vision, the place can be different, these things can be changed, and we want to inspire people to get on board. A lot of our work is building partnerships. You really can't do any of this stuff alone. If you really want to work in neighborhoods, you need to work with existing neighborhood organizations. And empowering communities, part of this idea of redesigning streets and making kind of transportation-friendly neighborhoods is empowering people to know what questions to ask. That was another thing that Phil Goff said when he came with me to one of our first public meetings that we went to around the street design project. He said, in Portland, everybody knows what concurrent timing is, and people know what a bike lane is. People know what to ask for, and people in Boston didn't even know the language to use when going to these public meetings. And so part of us was, how do we empower people through walks of the neighborhood to let people know that things can be different and how to talk about it, how to go to public meetings and be educated consumers. And the final thing was create change. I'm a doer, I'm an engineer, I like to fix things and I like to see them fixed. So we wanted to get hands-on with projects that we would see change actually happen on the ground with specific projects, and I'll talk about some of those. When we think about advocacy, I kind of put them in these three groupings. The first task is, at least where I was, is figuring out how to get government on board. Usually, at the beginning of these things, government's not really interested in doing these sorts of things. Now, once government says, all right, we'll do it, oftentimes they don't have any staff that know anything about the topic, and they can't actually produce any results. And so the next role of advocates is to bring that resource to the city to kind of jumpstart their engine and get them the technical assistance they need to get going. And the third thing is then government says, all right, we now know what we're doing. We've got good consultants in town. We have some staff that know what they're doing. We're now designing this stuff. But now the public are pushing back. They're mad that they're taking out this part where we're taking out parking spaces, or that we're changing the signal timing and it's not as good for the cars, or we're taking out a car lane. Then government says, now what are we supposed to do? They're all yelling at us. So then the role of advocates is to go into the neighborhoods and into the community and build the support for these projects in ways that government just generally isn't as capable of doing. So this was the framework that I sort of been working on over the last year, so kind of broke it up into stages. Before a new policy is adopted, then there's the point at which policy is adopted, then that early ramp-up phase where the know-how isn't there and advocates help in that stage. And then finally, when government's actively implementing things, how does advocates make sure that there's public support for that? And then that process will start over again, because we were doing this for bike lanes, and now we're doing this for separated bike facilities. So now, convincing government that they're going to do separated bike facilities. Now they don't know how to design them. How do you get them the resources? So it's kind of a loop. Same thing with Vision Zero. No one really knows what Vision Zero is. Government likes to talk about it, but how do you actually implement things that are going to get us toward Vision Zero? So now I'm going to talk about some of the stories. So how do you take a city that has 0.3 of a mile of bike lanes and try to do anything with them? Well, the first thing is some opportunism. I knew the editor of Bicycling Magazine, and I got him to list Boston again for the third time as the worst bicycling city in the country. Politically, that really helps. People don't like their city being named bad at anything. So that was amongst the more important early stages of things that we did. The second thing that we did was we realized that we had very little contact with different aspects of government. How do you get more contact with aspects of government? Well, you can start going in and yelling and demanding for changes on this street, or, we want these policies. Or you can say, we've got an idea. What about a bike ride? Who's opposed to a bike ride? Bike riding's great. We'll show people the neighborhoods. It'll be fun. And it created this excuse for us to work with all the different departments to set up this bike ride that's now an annual bike ride that is run by the city called Hub on Wheels. It also, after the second year, gave us an opportunity to shut down one of the highways and get a bunch of people riding on it and say, oh my God, look at all this space. We all thought we were cramped in the city, but look, on this Sunday, we can take over these highways with all these people. It sort of was this empowering kind of thing, and it was all through a bike ride that seemed kind of innocuous. So that was one of the earlier strategies that we used. Then there's always the lawsuit strategy. That you don't want to use lightly. What happened in Massachusetts in the early 90s, one of the legislators passed a law called the Bike Ped Accommodation Law. Everybody said how great it was. The law said anytime the state reconstructs a street, they are required by law to accommodate, to the best of their ability, bikes and pedestrians. Sounds great, right? Well, they were working on a street reconstruction project, and we thought it was terrible. So we said, why are you adding turn lanes, narrowing the sidewalk, and not putting in any bike lanes in this street? This is in 2006, 2007. It's not even that long ago. No bike lanes even under consideration, increasing the capacity. One of the things I do note is part of the funding source for this was CMAQ. For those who know, that's congestion mitigation and air quality. So they were using air quality money because if you add turn lanes, in the short term, it reduces the amount of congestion because in the short term, more cars are flowing. But all that does is induce demand, and then you end up with more cars. And in the long term, money that was used for clean air ends up creating less clean air. So it's one of these weird problems of these sorts of things. I see someone shaking their head, but don't worry, it gets better. We can solve these problems. That's what you're all here for. So we worked behind the scenes with them. One of the things I did was I worked with the regional MPO and said, all right, what if we get this money that's supposed to be spent by this year? What if we delay it by a year? So I worked behind the scenes to get all of those details worked out about how we could delay the project by a year, because what government was saying is, if we do anything different at this point, we're going to lose our money. And that's the last thing, so how do you fight against government when they say they're going to lose the money and the neighborhood was all concerned? So I worked behind the scenes to make that happen. Government was about to go to a community meeting and say, all right, we're going to delay the project by a year, but we're going to reconstruct it. We're going to do a kind of a rapid redesign, and it's all going to be great. Government's going to be a hero. Well, the weekend before that presentation, one of the high-level people in the commissioner's office went golfing with the mayor and told the mayor it was a really bad idea. And so then the mayor comes back the next day and tells his chief of policy, who I'd been working with, we're not doing that anymore. And the next day, they go and they say, we're not doing it anymore. Now, that was devastating as an advocate to have spent all of this time solving all of their problems behind the scenes, so they didn't have any work to do. I mean, they would have some work to do. I'm kind of exaggerating. But I solved all their political problems. I worked with the highway commissioner. Everything was worked out, and then they just decided they didn't want to do it because the risk was too high. And having worked for government, I can also see that side. It's like you have to, the risks of changing things midstream are challenging. So we sued them. That was exciting. So the bike ped accommodation law said you have to build these things with bike accommodation. And we said, there's no bike lanes. How could you even in 2006 claim that there was any bike accommodation if you don't even have bike lanes on this major street? So we thought that would work out pretty well. Well, the lawsuit was thrown out, not for any important content reasons, but simply because the way the law was written, the only person who could sue was the Attorney General for the state of Massachusetts. And who represents the Mass Highway Department and the Massachusetts Department of Transportation? Oh, yeah, the same person, the Attorney General. So anyways, that didn't end up working out. So I'm kind of sad about that. But we did push to do the next step, which is saying, well, if you're going to keep the median and you're not going to redesign things, we're going to get bike lanes on the street. Part of it is, I mean, that's why I went into advocacy. It's sort of like maybe I'm a rabid dog. I was like, you're going to have bike lanes on this street, and I'm going to make sure we do that. But what was the problem? The problem was that these lanes would have to be 10 feet wide. 10 feet wide. Those are some narrow lanes. We're going to create some serious deaths. The world is going to collapse with 10-foot lanes. No, absolutely not. It's totally fine. And there are tons of examples already in Boston with 10-foot lanes, with buses. It's all going to be fine. I will say that this was definitely not ideal to have a narrower bike lane than 5 feet next to parked cars. So this is not the desirable outcome, but it's better than nothing. So we ended up spending a lot of time working with the Highway Department and Federal Highway to get approval to have 10-foot lanes. That took a while, but we managed to do that. I don't know anyone who knows what this book is. How many engineers are in the audience? All right, this is the time when you're supposed to genuflect down to the green book. This is the green book that tells us how to do our work, and we don't have to think. That's the beauty of engineering. We don't have to think, right? No. Let's read the introduction to this book, which I actually read out loud at a public meeting, and the highway official told me that this did not come from the green book. The intent of this policy is to provide guidance. Guidance is not rule. To the designer. Oops. Now they're calling us designers. I thought we were engineers. Engineers, designers. Designing things. That means we have to use our own intuition and best practices. Interesting. Referencing a recommended range of values. Not only is it a range of values, but it's just a recommended range. They then go on to say sufficient flexibility is permitted to encourage independent designs. Independent doesn't sound cookie cutter to me. Tailored to particular situations, meaning that every situation could be different, and we better sit down and think about it. This is in the beginning of this book. So if you ever have trouble with any engineers, feel free to take out the introduction to the book. It's the most important part. And this is what it looks like today. So we were kind of excited we managed to succeed in that one. So how does this work? How do you get a mayor who was pretty opposed to biking get up in front of the public? And this is Phil Goff, who's a Portland guy. How do you get the mayor to change their mind and say, all right, I think we're going to do this? So what ended up happening, as with most things, is it was luck. I'd like to say that it was all of our advocacy prowess that forced them into this. No, we had set the stage. This wouldn't have happened if we hadn't gotten to that point. But what happened was the chief of policy went to the doctor, and the doctor says, you need to do more exercise. So he goes home and says, I think I'm going to start biking. He starts biking. He likes it. He falls in love with it. He drinks the Kool-Aid. Now he's into biking. He comes to work, and the mayor, this is like the second in command to the mayor. He comes to work, and the mayor's making fun of him for biking. And so they're joking around back and forth. And he wasn't really biking into work or anything. He was just doing it for recreation. So he ended up calling in the head of that bike ride that we had helped form and someone from transportation. And he called them into his office, and he said, I hear Boston is rated the worst bike city. Hence, lucky we got that in the Bicycling magazine. I heard we're rated really badly. What can we do to fix it? And everyone turned their head. This is the first time anyone from the mayor's office said, what could we do to fix it? What's amazing about this is the turnaround time between, and so what those folks did is they said, you got to talk to Jeff. You got to strategize. He'll help you figure out what to do. And so I was sort of his behind-the-scenes advisor for a couple months, like meeting twice a week, to give him advice on what's going on in other cities. What's Chicago doing? What's Portland doing? What's Europe doing? Why is this important? Why should you care? How do you convince the mayor that this is important? Within 3 months, he managed to convince the mayor, and they launched a bike program. Now, for someone who's been a mayor since like the early 90s, for a ship that big to turn around in 3 months, I personally was shocked at how that happened. A few years later, he started saying the car is no longer king. I mean, this is just phenomenal. You could never even imagine this mayor saying the car is no longer king and having this plastered on all the bike share bikes. Pretty incredible. So now what's happening within government? Advocates have been fighting against government on this bike issue for a long time. So now, how does this work? Are we supposed to all of a sudden be best buddies and now we're all friends? Well, in some ways, yes. In some ways, no. But it's a hard shift. I like this cartoon because it's like the guy comes running in and says, no. Government's no longer the problem. They're the solution. And the mayor's about to have his head chopped off. So we have to make this transition from advocacy to say, all right, well, in some cases we're pushing the government, but in many cases we then need to collaborate with government to help actually make this stuff happen because they're the ones that own the streets and are going to make the change. So I helped them put together an initial bike summit that brought in a bunch of the stakeholders. They didn't even know who to talk to about any of this bike stuff. They knew no one in the neighborhoods. They didn't know Bikes Not Bombs. They didn't really know who the players were. They didn't know the people at public health that were caring about transportation. So someone had to bring all those stakeholders together. As part of that, we decided to pick a project. So at this point, this was one of the projects that was under design, and this was the city's plan. Wide outside lanes. Oh, my favorite. Don't you love biking in wide outside lanes? Oh, not a big fan of that. All right, well, me neither. We didn't think that was such a good idea. They were getting rid of one of the travel lanes, so that was exciting. But no bike accommodation at all, that just wasn't going to fly. So we decided collaboratively with us and this new bicycle coordinator that this was going to be a project we were going to use as a demonstration project. I'll also say that this is through the heart of Boston University. Do you think the administration thought that this was a good idea to have bike lanes? No. They were opposed to the project because they didn't understand it, and they were afraid they were going to lose the money, and they kind of just was like, whatever Boston says is fine, we don't really care, it's not important to us. I mean, it's kind of crazy that a university wouldn't even support bike lanes. So we had to mobilize the students to fight against the administration around having bike lanes. So what happened was the city, now that they had this bike program, said, all right, we'll design bike lanes. So they called in their consultants, and they put together a plan, and then they called us in. Phil Goff and I came in and showed us this plan. And the plan had bike lanes just for the typical cross-section. At every intersection, there was nothing. And so we're sitting there with the engineer. We're like, well, what do you think? What are you thinking? Have you ever been on a bike? Like, the typical cross-section is the easiest place to bike. It's through the intersections that are the problem. And they said, well, the manual didn't tell us exactly what to do, so we didn't really know what to do. So it's suggested where you don't have enough space, you just drop the bike lane. And we're thinking, no, come on, that's ridiculous. We got yelled at pretty badly by the Commissioner of Transportation, but we did luckily design it ourselves and pulled out the design and said, well, we do think it's possible, and here's the design. So part of it was how to do this in a collaborative way, how to accept getting yelled at but still push forward and get them to acknowledge that they just don't have the technical expertise to design bike lanes. And these are the bike lanes today. Even the New York Times picked up that something was happening in Boston. These bike lanes were put in 2009 and were even painted green. It was very exciting. The other thing that we did, part of this multimodal aspect of Livable Streets, is not just about bikes, but it's about transit and walking. Part of the reconstruction project that at that point was almost finished, because the construction was already underway while we were negotiating this whole bike lane situation. We got them they added a turn lane onto a bridge, and we got them to cancel one of the turn lanes, saying, adding capacity, this is right through a university, there's no space for the pedestrians to queue, just is not going to work, and we got them to do that. My boss at the City of Cambridge calls this the Jeff Memorial Pork Chop. Engineers call those little extra pieces of asphalt pork chops, so according to her, it's the Jeff Memorial Pork Chop. All right, I'm going to talk about another project. Actually, that intersection is right here. So they added an extra turn lane onto this bridge. So yes, connecting bridges is a pinch point, but it's also a pinch point for bikes. I do want to point out the number of jurisdictions that were involved in trying to deal with this bridge project. So this is the City of Cambridge over here. This is a highway owned and operated by the Department of Conservation and Recreation, which is a state organization. The bridges were just transferred by law over to the Highway Department, to the state. We've got a railroad bridge here, which is owned by CSX. Then we have more DCR property here. Then over here, this is the City of Boston. This is a turnpike, so this is owned by the Turnpike Authority. These decks are turnpike. Then we have a trolley going across, so that's the MBTA. Right next to Boston is Brookline, which is over here. So those are all the agencies involved in this particular jurisdiction. It was not an easy nut to crack, and no one at any of these levels of government wanted to take the lead. So it's another example of how advocates can actually help different government agencies where no one wants to take the lead pull people together. So what was the problem here? Well, there was no bike lanes. There were 2 lanes going each direction for cars. Those lanes are 10 feet, by the way, and they've been that way for the past 60 years. So this whole 10-foot thing was kind of crazy in other places. And there was no place for biking. Major artery between Boston and Cambridge, and bikes who didn't want to ride in the street or were sort of getting stuck in this sort of thing would ride on the sidewalk. And there's a lot of pedestrians going across, so it just was not tenable. Nothing was really, so, you know, this is what people like me do over beers. Don't worry, you all will start doing this over beers too when you graduate and start working. You start sketching this stuff out. You're like, well, it could be different. It doesn't have to be the way it is today. Let's see how could it be different? So I had this crazy idea from a traffic engineering perspective. What you really want is 2 lanes at the intersection. You care less about the 2 lanes entering into the flow of traffic, because when the traffic light turns green, if you can have 2 lanes going, you get more cars through per traffic light signal. So the idea was, well, what if we took away one of the 4 lanes, split the 10 in half, gave 5 and 5, put bike lanes on each side, and then just narrowed the travel lane so you just had 1 entering and 2 exiting, and you have this weird kind of thing in the middle where it opens up from 1 lane to 2 lanes on each side in the center. Anything that is not a straight line, like traffic engineers are good with this one. That line's nice and straight. This is not so good. So that wasn't a very popular item. But I came up with this idea with a friend like 10 years ago. The only reason that we had an opportunity to do something was the bridge was about to be reconstructed. And so whenever you have a reconstruction project, that's when advocates have an opportunity because you have the attention of government on something. So what does a good engineer do if you want to study that? I'm a good engineer. You come up with a table of numbers called the level of service. Level of service will tell you whether you can do it or not. What you do is you put everything into a computer, and out comes yes or no. And if it says no, you can't do it. That's what the engineers say when you come to the meetings. They said, no, the level of service analysis says no. Well, they're not that strict about it, but they do grade it. But they grade it just like you do in grade school and in high school. So this is how you show it. So I'm supposed to go to a politician. I'm supposed to go to the city councilor and say, we've got this great idea. Let's leave it the way it is, and we get a C. Or we can add bike lanes, and we can take that level of service down to an F or a D. Who wants the F and the D? And F means fail, by the way. D means really pretty dumb. So the way we structured the whole conversation was flawed at the beginning. So obviously we weren't going to stand for that. But the public weighs in on this sort of thing. This was headlines of the Boston Globe. BU bridge plans spur road rage. I mean, this is just phenomenal. This is like not what you want to wake up to in the morning as an advocate. Some fear closing lane, choking traffic. I mean, it sounds like a health crisis right there. All because we're trying to get bikes across the bridge. It was really quite phenomenal. That was 2009, early on. So what we did was we said, look, level of service is totally not the way to assess the situation. Let's take a step back and understand what's the real problem. The real problem is you don't want traffic to back up so far that it's going to create kind of problems at other locations. That's the concern. The concern is not how many cars do you get through per hour. Because the issue is if the peak 15 minutes of the day, so what if people have to wait longer? That's what happens at peak hour. You have to wait longer to drive places. So we convinced them to do an analysis of queue length rather than level of service. So we took the level of service sheet and we threw it out the window. I put it through the shredder. No, I actually hand ripped it up. I was very pleased. So we said, this is a better way of looking at it. Once they looked at it, they realized, yeah, you're right. If you use this as the metric to decide whether you're going to do it or not, it doesn't seem so bad anymore. And so we convinced government that it was a good idea. Guess what university is right here that was opposed to the idea? Boston University. Didn't like the idea because the administrators would take longer to get to work. So they were concerned with that. Obviously, we weren't pleased with that. So what we ended up doing, so we ended up winning. It was very exciting. So what do advocates do as soon as you get something that you've been working so hard for? You thank you notes. Thank you notes. My mom taught me that, and that's the way we do it. So we had ambassadors go out on the street and hand out postcards that were going to BU, telling the administrators how much we appreciated their support for the project, even though they didn't. And the state and the city and said, this is great, thank you, we know it was challenging, this is fantastic, we're using it every day. And that had a really big impact on government because they felt for the first time that they had done something kind of risky because of that Globe article, but they really had the support of people who really wanted this. I was really excited because when you work on something for years, it had been like 8 years at that point that I had this idea of adding bike lanes to this bridge. So I woke up, put my child on the bike to the bridge. I knew, because I knew the highway engineers, I knew they were striping it that night, so I knew exactly when to go, and I called the Globe, and I told them, this is the morning to do it, so send out the reporter. It was all kind of orchestrated. And the Globe took a picture of my daughter and put in the Globe. So it's her first picture in the newspaper. It's very exciting. So we do have an ambassador program. That's a pretty key part of the work that Livable Streets does. And that is that part of building the community support and building membership and building the awareness of these projects. So we send people out on the street, and some of the postcards we have people fill out are pretty simple. We try to keep it not very wonky. Like, why do you feel the street is unsafe? Why do you want better transportation? Why do you want these buses to run faster? And try to elicit people's stories. And it turns out that by packaging these stories, we end up getting a lot of traction with government. One of the meetings we had about separated bike lanes with government, we took a bunch of these stories about a street that we were trying to get separated bike lanes on. We had this stack of postcards. It sort of happened randomly, but we broke them out into little groups of 10, put rubber bands around them, brought them to the meeting to put on the table, and then the executive director had this great idea. She just took this stack that I had already kind of broken up into 10 to make it look like a big pile, and we handed them out to all the consultants and all the city officials and state officials that happened to have been at that meeting. This was an internal meeting, and they sat there and they were like flipping through, reading about why the public really wants this thing that we were sitting there in this dingy, government office trying to convince them that this was a good idea. And it really was a powerful moment that I remember. One of the things, a couple more points, and then I'll wrap up. One of the things was that I mentioned before about the technical capacity is that the city really didn't have technical capacity at the time, nor did any of the consulting firms at the time. So one of the things that I did was I worked with some of the people at the city to write an RFP for things such that they would attract the right consultants that weren't in Boston, and then worked with the consultants to help them understand who they should team with in Boston because they were from out of state, and everything works like old boy network in this transportation world. So I sort of acted as facilitator between government and the consulting world to try to create a new consulting environment in Boston. So now we have Tool Design Group and Alta Planning and Kittleson Associates. And so part of that was an advocacy effort, a conscious advocacy effort, to acknowledge that we just don't have the technical resources in town, and we can't continue to provide them for the city. They need to have consultants that they can go to. And I served on this Boston Complete Streets guide. At the time, it was pretty crazy. I mean, this was early on, and they said, we're going to put out a contract to develop a Complete Streets guide. I mean, this was 6 months earlier. There was no bike lanes, so it's kind of amazing that they turned around. I guess when you're that low on the totem pole, it's easy to ramp up fast. So, and we do a lot of outreach events like good advocates do, but we try to package things not in terms of specific kind of like this is a bicycle thing or this is a transit thing, but about we want the city to be a different place, and how can we do that and inspire people to get involved. And then the last piece is this opposition. The public starts opposing things. When you want to put in bike lanes, there's trade-offs. All of this street space is limited. Everything comes with trade-offs. How do you deal with the trade-offs? The community oftentimes is the one dealing with the trade-offs. One of the things that I joke about my job at the city of Cambridge was I probably spent 80% of the time as what I call a parking negotiator. Everything I did had to do with negotiating this parking space. How can I take away 2 rather than 3? How can I move the sight lines 3 feet so I can save 1 parking space? I mean, I probably spent 3 days saving 1 or 2 parking spaces. I mean, I never thought that I would be a parking space saver. But it's all of this delicate balance between the public not wanting these other things to go away. They want everything. So the city was having trouble on a couple bike lane projects. One, they were going to do bike lanes. It seemed so straightforward. It wasn't even taking away any capacity. The community said no because they weren't involved, and that involved a lot of support from us. The second thing that Boston did, which was pretty amazing, is on this stretch, on a part of Mass Ave, similar to that street that we did the suing about, they wanted to put in bike lanes, and there was just no space. So they took out parking on an entire stretch of this important roadway. I was shocked that they were even willing to try doing that. And so we worked together, city and advocates, to say, okay, well, we're going to try to make this work. How do we work with the community to get buy-in on this? And they did it. I think this was amongst the most amazing things that the city of Boston ended up pulling off in their kind of first round of transportation improvements. Another advocacy tactic, I mentioned that I go to the Netherlands and teach a class with Peter First and Northeastern. One thing I did was worked with the transportation reporter for the Globe and got her to be able to come to the Netherlands and tag along with us for a couple days and then write a cover story about separated bike lanes. So part of advocacy is how to get this message out to the broader public in ways that people are going to see it, and the Boston Globe is a good way of doing it. Now, the backstory. How does that actually happen? How do you get the train? You just don't call up the transportation reporter, and they don't just call up their editor. Well, in this random thing, a BU student had been killed by a truck right in front of Boston University. The parent called the editor of the Globe and said, if that street was designed with European-style facilities, my kid would not be dead. The editor hangs up the phone, walks over to this reporter who I'd already talked to, and said, I'm sending you to Europe to study separated bike lanes. And she said, oh, well, I've got a plan. I've got it all worked out. He said, fine, go to the budget office and you're going. So it's sort of, some of this stuff is totally random, but you got to plant all these seeds and see which ones are actually going to happen. So I'm going to finish with this just because it was so inspiring in the Netherlands to see this. I mean, this takes safe routes to school to a totally different level. This is a normal, everyday occurrence. You'll notice that this is not a bike-only street. This is a shared street with cars and bikes. Gotta love the glasses. All right, so this is amongst my favorite moments. So the girl gets a broken leg. So does she get driven to school? No, she just hops on the back of the bus, gets off with her crutches. Close with this whole idea that we've got some problems out there and you're all going to school to try to solve these problems. And one of the things that I focus on as an engineer, as a planner, as an advocate, as a government person is that if we want to solve these problems, we have to think about them differently than we've thought about them before. If we think about them using all the same tools and all the same thought processes, we're probably going to get to all the same bad solutions that we used to have. So how do we think about those things differently? How do we put a totally new lens on this? That's you guys' job. I'll leave that one to you. Thanks a lot. So I apologize for going over a little bit. I know you all are required to have questions, and so I'm required to answer them. That's fantastic. Am I supposed to do the calling? Yeah, you can. Fantastic. So I'll go this way toward this way, kind of. Yes?
Has the law regarding reasonable accommodations in Boston been changed to allow advocacy groups to sue?
No.
Is there a way to do that?
Sure, but at this point, it's probably not our biggest lever. At this point, there's so much buy-in on it. We've sort of passed that boat. But honestly, even suing them with a law that didn't actually win created a lot of agitation, for sure. Yeah.
Hi, my name is David Warner, civil engineering. I actually had 15 years of professional experience as a landscape architect working on streets and master plans. So I worked on the Green Street master plan for the city of Omaha. It's harder to sell in Omaha. So I see your role as invaluable, but I have to ask how you get paid. And how do the consultants that provide that technical expertise, are they doing so for pro bono on the side, or are they getting paid too?
At the point where they're operating in the world of consulting, they're working, they're getting paid. And from our perspective as advocates, that's good. If government is going to use tax dollars to get consulting services, they should be using it to get good consulting services. Our role, I feel like our role as advocates is that bridge of technical assistance in that interim period, but also use the technical knowledge to empower communities and say, this is the knowledge you need to know so that you can ask for what you want. Now, some of it is, you go to communities and they're like, we don't want that. why do we want that? So some of it's also the selling of the vision and the getting buy-in and finding out what people want. And so it's a very complicated thing. But how to make money on doing this? You don't. I mean, I guess someone who founds a nonprofit and then goes back to school to get a Ph.D. somehow just, failed at the money-making endeavor. And my wife reminds me of that regularly. Yes.
Michael Flynn, civil engineering. Earlier, maybe the first or second slide, you said you previously had looked to Portland. Do you still look to Portland at all, or who do you look to today?
That's a good question. I think we still look to Portland, especially because of your light rail system and the fact that you've pre-thought that so far in advance, and now you're starting to see that. I also think that one of the things that Portland brought to the table that was really important is, and I'm probably not supposed to draw on the board, but I'm going to anyways, why not? So, what do you do if this is biking, or this is time, and this is biking, and the line is like that, and this is today? If you're a politician, what do you say? Everything's great. We don't need to change. The slope is positive. We're just going to keep going. Well, Portland recognized that you're only going to get a certain amount of bicyclists that are going to bike in bike lanes on the street. In high-stress environments, you're only going to get a certain number. And this is going to go like this, and then you're going to have nothing. And from what I hear, that's kind of what's happening in Portland. So Portland's really looking, like a lot of other cities, to that next generation separated bike facilities, low-stress environments, communities that you can have these 20-minute zones where you can get to comfortable places to bike. And so that concept was identified by Portland officials early on in this process, years ago, and I think that's a piece that everybody is still trying to digest for cities that haven't gotten to the leveling off point. Yeah?
Ben Baumgartner, Urban Planning. I was impressed by that map of the Boston region with that range of municipalities and as well as this kind of crossover of jurisdiction you talked about. Do you know, is there an organization like Metro that we have in Portland, kind of an overarching intergovernmental organization in Boston?
No, we're very parochial.
Okay. And is there any of these places where just like line on the map, political viability just disappears for these kinds of projects? Is it in the outer suburbs? Is it?
The way that we focused, I was asked this morning, how does LivableStreets define its kind of coverage area? And a lot of it had to do with that transit map. All world-class biking cities or world-class transit cities, world-class walking cities, these things are all combined together. And so what we said was we're going to focus our efforts on places where there is transit or there's really potential to add transit, where there's density, and that was where we decided to draw our line. So we didn't draw geographic boundaries. We sort of drew an amorphous blob around density in a way. And it's not to say those other places don't need work. They call us all the time and say, can you help us? Can you advocate for us? I mean, the question of money, it's hard to convince anyone to pay us to do this work. It's hard. It's a hard sell. Yes?
Ian Clancy at Transportation. I was just confused about something you said sort of earlier on the first few slides. You said you were, like in Boston, you were having trouble getting like some bike advocacy group on board with you because they were opposed to...
So there's a movement that some of you know called vehicular cycling. So some of you heard of the 5 E's, the education, enforcement, and blah, blah, blah. So there's one train of thought that is pretty much all but died out, luckily, that was started for a reason. There was a reason why it started, and it was fear of bicyclists being evicted from the roadway system. So the idea was, if you put a bike lane there, you're going to restrict us from all these other areas you don't have bike lanes. So it made rational sense at the time in the 70s when there was really kind of this rush to sort of say, all right, no bikes, let's just have cars everywhere. But this group continued under a particularly vocal leader and said, education and enforcement, that's what matters. You want cyclists to act like a car, you want cyclists to be trained, and you want to enforce all the rules, and everybody will behave, and it will all be fine. If you do that, you're only going to get this many people biking, like there. But in some ways, they don't really care. They say, if you want the number to go up, educate more cyclists. But it's just not going to happen. It happened to be that leaders of that movement also headed up the local bike advocacy group, and one of those leaders was the bicycle coordinator for the city of Boston in the year 2000 and 2002. So clearly no bike lanes were built when he was the bicycle coordinator. So that was a real challenge that we had. Other cities have it as well, but I think we had it particularly bad. a curious thing is that the city of Cambridge, which I worked, started in the 90s putting in bike lanes and had to work so hard at keeping him out of the picture. So in essence, government took the lead. There was no advocating. There was no advocates telling the city of Cambridge to put in bike stuff. The city of Cambridge were the advocates at the time. In the back, yeah?
How do you coordinate with the walk advocacy folks?
A lot of relationship building. And what's interesting is the types of language that we were using about complete streets and multimodal. What's interesting is 5 years after we were founded, they started using the same language and started to sound like us. So I think they realized the value. One of the things we didn't do was we did not become a membership organization when I founded the organization, because those two organizations already had membership. And the last thing I wanted to do was start making this like it's a competition. So it was delicate, but we looked for ways that we could work together. On the projects that I mentioned, they were kind of co-sponsors of those projects. We put all our names on the letterheads when we sent stuff. And so that was the first time that any advocacy group actually brought together a bunch of other advocacy groups to do something together. And the Complete Streets multimodal concept allowed us to do that. Yes?
So I have a question about benchmarks for your city then. So you talked about having some opposition from the mayor's office and how it took a lot of time for you to get any support there. So like in the city of Chicago, we have like a 5% goal for 5% bicycle trips for trips under 5 miles in the next 5 years. Do you have any benchmarks like that now in your city?
They've got some benchmarks, but we just had a change of administration. That mayor didn't run for re-election. He was there since the late 80s. We have a new mayor. What happened right before the mayor left, which is another whole thing, is the staff worked really hard to put together as many plans as possible before the mayor left. So we have a bike plan that has very visionary goals and metrics for achieving them. But then the next mayor comes in and says, and not really an overly bike-friendly kind of person from the start, neither is his staff. And so he said, well, that's great, but that's not our bike plan. That's their bike plan. We're going to put our own mark on things. And so he launched a 2-year transportation planning process to try to decide what the benchmarks are going to be. So that's been a struggle as well. Yes?
So with LivableStreets not being a bike-specific or walk-specific group, I'm curious, what types of advocates did you primarily attract? Was it more bike people, more walking people?
Mm-hmm. These are great questions. This is what, I was meeting with some folks at BTA, Boston, the Vice. Tell me, my brain isn't working. BTA, you guys know what it is, and talking with their board and asking some of the same questions. Bike advocates, cyclists identify as cyclists, whereas people who walk and people who take transit don't. One of the things that's happening is, these people down like here, they may identify as cyclists and sort of have that identity, but one of the differences I've seen between all those new people, like I said, bicycling has tripled in Boston, so if we take the 1/3 that was already there, they kind of look like cyclists, cyclists wearing clothes and special cycling stuff, but that actually the other 2/3, in Boston at least, look like very normal people. And that is a real difference in thinking about how to attract advocates. Those people think about the city and think about their life and think about their neighborhood. They think about biking as something that they happen to do along with driving and along with taking transit and along with walking. So having it packaged not as just a bike organization actually has been really helpful for us. But when push comes to shove, it's the bike advocates that are willing to go out on the street and make stuff happen. So that they're a very strong constituent in terms of being more experienced with advocacy and being more experienced with trying to make social change. Yeah?
So the role of advocates is clear, proposing, pushing the politics. The role of city staff is also a legal contract between city council that hired you to do your engineering work, and you're an engineer. I'm wondering how you negotiate that. You're not really allowed to advocate as a city staff. You have inside knowledge.
Why aren't you allowed to advocate? You just made a pretty normative statement there.
Well, your job is to do whatever city council basically hired you to do.
Allegedly. I think this is a debate. This is a debate amongst practitioners. I mean, one of the things, especially at planning school at MIT, this is definitely a topic of conversation. I mean, one of the things that I think people don't recognize enough of is the culture, at least in Cambridge, the culture of city employees is what you described. The culture is, you're not supposed to tell the community what they want. You're supposed to be open to everything. But then how do you be a professional? How do you take all of this collective knowledge and design something different and then try to sell it to the community? So people say, oh, well, you didn't do a good enough job selling that project to the community. But then they say, but you're not allowed to do any outreach because that would be selling it to the community. I mean, it's sort of this catch-22. So I don't have an answer for that one, but I encourage everyone here to be thinking about what is that role of you as a professional within whatever discipline you are, whether you're working for city or whether you're working for a consultant. Because you can have the same conversation about consultants. Oh, they're not allowed to push the envelope because they're just supposed to do what they're told. Well, I signed a contract as an engineer that I'm supposed to do good for society. I'm not just supposed to do good for my employer. So everyone who signs their engineering contract will hopefully know that there's more to the profession than just who your boss is. It also might mean quitting, but these are all part of the difficult conversations that happen.
Before we close, next week we have Dr. Haidong Wang from Oregon State University to talk about trade-off between residential location and transportation cost. Now let's thank Jeff again for a fantastic backstory about local